All over the world, LGBTIQ+ persons suffer serious human rights violations because of who they are. In many countries, deeply rooted discriminatory attitudes and inadequate laws expose LGBTIQ+ persons to violence, including torture and other ill treatment. LGBTIQ+ discrimination is often entrenched in laws which criminalize private and consensual same-sex relationships. These are often referred to using derisive terms such as indecent practices, unnatural offences, or carnal contact against the order of nature. Such discriminatory laws further expose LGBTIQ+ persons to arrests, prosecution, and imprisonment, fueling violence and preventing victims from speaking out. Violence against LGBTIQ+ persons often amounts to torture and can take many forms, including physical and sexual abuse by state officials or non-state actors, forced medical examinations, conversion therapy practices, corrective rapes, and other forms of harassment. Torture is one of the most serious crimes that can be committed against a person. It aims to dehumanize victims through calculated acts of cruelty, to remove their dignity and leave them powerless. The right to be free from torture is absolute and cannot be overridden. 4 elements are essential to establish torture as defined by the UN Convention Against Torture. The conduct must cause severe pain or suffering. It must be inflicted intentionally. It must be inflicted for a specific purpose. There needs to be the involvement of a state official in some way. Violence against LGBTIQ+ persons based on discrimination against their actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity constitutes torture, as long as the other requirements are also present. Regional human rights courts have condemned such discriminatory torture. For example, in the case of Azul Rojas Marin, a transgender woman who was raped, beaten and verbally abused by police in Peru due to her sexual orientation. In 2020, the Inter-American Court made a landmark decision finding that Azul had been tortured for a discriminatory purpose, which could be implied from the circumstances in which the violence occurred. This was the first decision by a human rights court on LGBTIQ+ torture. Under the UN Convention Against Torture, states must investigate whenever there are reasonable grounds to believe that torture and other ill treatment has been committed. This obligation includes both the victim's right to file a complaint and their right to have it investigated to determine the facts, to hold perpetrators accountable, and to ensure victims obtain reparation. Investigations must be prompt, impartial, effective, thorough, and transparent. These principles have been confirmed in judgments by the European and Inter-American Courts of Human Rights in relation to investigations for LGBTIQ+ torture. In Azul's case against Peru, the Inter-American Court emphasized states' obligation to investigate discriminatory purposes, ruling that they should take all reasonable measures to establish whether violence was motivated by discrimination. This finding was reinforced in the case of Vicky Hernandez versus Honduras, where the Inter-American Court found that failing to recognize a victim's gender identity could limit lines of investigation and result in the true motive for the violence being ignored. While torture against LGBTIQ+ persons is not uncommon, in practice such acts are rarely investigated and impunity remains widespread. Despite strong international standards, national authorities often fail to investigate potential discriminatory motives, treating discriminatory torture cases as ordinary cases of violence or assault. Even where investigations do proceed, legislative, institutional, or practical issues often result in inadequate or weak investigations being carried out by states' authorities. All this further perpetuates discriminatory torture against the LGBTIQ+ community. To ensure that LGBTIQ+ violence and torture is effectively investigated, states must understand that LGBTIQ+ violence can constitute torture, criminalize torture and identify discrimination as a potential purpose, repeal discriminatory laws, adopt guidelines to investigate LGBTIQ+ torture, ensure that investigations are done by independent and well-trained investigative bodies, create effective mechanisms for complaints and victims and witnesses protection, train law enforcement, judicial and medical personnel on LGBTIQ+ rights and anti-torture standards. Knowing if the torture was motivated by discrimination is key for LGBTIQ+ victims to access justice and obtain reparations, and to address the root causes.